Hey everybody, Legendary Sponge here with another Smash Bros. Video. This is just a fun little video. I was rewatching some videos from some older YouTubers from a couple years ago about Smash Bros. And I noticed this video that they had made about um, a topic that was actually pretty unique and I was interested in, so I decided to make my own version of it, which is what if I was Sakurai and I could make my own version of each Smash Bros. Roster? Um, Essentially just that. For the purposes of this, I made my rosters basically the same sort of way Sakurai did, just choosing different characters. I didn't really put any limitations on myself. Third-party characters are fine. You'll see how I did that. Um, their clones are not necessarily good or bad in the situation, but feasible at least. So I guess I'll just start. Most people are in agreement that the original roster for Super Smash Bros. 64 was pretty solid. 12 characters, what people call the original 12 now. The roster there was pretty solid for a first game. All they really had to do was just take 12 Nintendo All-Stars and just put them in a fighting game together. Like a lot of people, I am in agreement that really all you need to do to make that roster make that much more sense is just take out Luigi and Jigglypuff and add in characters of different franchises. And I actually changed it a little bit more than that, but, get into it. The way I did it was I replaced Luigi, Jigglypuff, and Captain Falcon with Little Mac, Pit, and Marth. It's different because a lot of people just keep Captain Falcon and take out one of those three newcomers or just other characters. But point is, Captain Falcon stays and normally Little Mac goes. And this strikes a little bit of controversy because like, oh, why would you take out Captain Falcon? He's the icon of Smash Brothers. But I'll get into that in a minute. I like the idea of having Little Mac in the most, at this point, out of those three, he is the most iconic Nintendo character. His moveset would probably be a little bit generic because, I mean, he is a boxer, but still, he's got some capabilities, he can do some cool stuff. And same essentially goes for Pit. There's moveset potential, there's different, he's been in multiple games, he's pretty much a Nintendo All-Star at this point. And Marth is another interesting one because Marth at this point had never had a game outside of Japan. So that's sort of a controversial thing, but at the same time, they ran into that issue eventually with Melee anyway, so you might as well just get it out here. Plus, Smash 64 was originally a Japan-only game, so the idea of having a Japan-only character in there isn't really too far-fetched, even if it didn't actually happen in the final game. So, I mean, overall, Smash 64's roster is pretty solid. I just changed a few things just based on what I think would have worked better, but still. Anyway, moving on. Second, we have Melee's roster. This is pretty different, but overall fairly similar to the final Melee roster. I added 10 characters, those being Luigi, Peach, Bowser, Diddy Kong, Captain Falcon, Zelda, Ganon, King Dedede, Charizard, Mewtwo, and yeah, that's it. 10 newcomers. Melee itself had 25 playable characters, so it more than doubled Melee's roster. I don't think that's necessarily necessary for a Smash Bros. Game. I didn't feel the need to keep the rosters the same number. I was trying to do that when I started out, but I actually ran into the problem of not really having enough characters that I think really could fit in well with the Melee roster, so I just sort of kept it as is. And the design is fine, so, I decided to keep it as is. This is where, as a whole, this roster is fairly similar to what we got eventually with Melee, so I guess I'll just go into it. 3 Mario newcomers, Luigi, Peach, and Bowser. They're all in Melee. Luigi first came in 64 in real life, and he was pretty much a clone of Mario. they did a good job of differentiating him out from Mario in Melee by giving him some different moves, but he was still fairly cloney. Um, a lot of people seem to be in agreement that they shouldn't have added Luigi until Brawl, with him having more of a personality from Luigi's Mansion and the Mario and Luigi games and Paper Mario and such. I added him here because he's one of two secondary characters. I was going to say, I wanted to put Diddy Kong in here just because of the amount of interesting moveset potential he had. And I just think it's really weird to have Diddy Kong and not have Luigi, because they're pretty much the same, but Luigi is way more iconic than Diddy Kong. They pretty much serve the same purpose, so why would I have the less famous one but not the more famous one? So that's pretty much why I have that. I mean, Luigi does deserve to be in there to begin with anyway, so, you know. I added Peach and Bowser. I added them pretty much just because of the same reasons they were added actually in Melee. So, you know, they're iconic Nintendo characters that had been in quite a few games at that point, so I just sort of felt they were good additions. I did Diddy Kong, as I said, just because there's a lot of different moveset potential there, and I just thought he was a good pick to add. I added Zelda for essentially the same reason she was added into Melee, another really iconic Nintendo character. Now, this is a pretty different thing from what we actually got in Melee, which I have Ganon on here instead of Ganondorf. This is Pig Beastkin. We're talking about like Link to the Past, Oracle games, I guess. This I added as just Ganon for a number of reasons. You know, there's the fact that Ganon actually became a clone of Captain Falcon in Melee, whereas with Pig Beast Ganon, that's not at all a possibility. But more importantly, at this point in time, sure, Ocarina of Time was still a very popular game, despite it being out for like, what, 3 years at this point? But at the same time, you know, he'd only ever been in the Ganondorf state in one game, whereas he'd been Pig Beast Ganon in several at that point. It's like, what, 4, 5? Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Link to the Past, the Oracle games. You could, no, not Link's Awakening. He'd been in that state in 5 games, whereas he'd only been in the Ganondorf state in 1. And I feel like it better represents him as a whole, since he's only ever been Ganondorf like 3 times in the whole series, and he's been Ganon like 10. So, you know, that's something. And also, I do like the idea of having him use the daggers he's got, and he's got magic and stuff. It would have been an interesting moveset had they gone with just Ganon. You know, they very well could have made him an interesting character with Ganondorf, not even necessarily giving him a sword, but also giving him magic powers and crap. You know, it could have been cool, but obviously it's just a clone. Next we have DDD. Kirby 64 had just come out at this point. I was thinking about whether I should put Meta Knight or DDD on here. I thought DDD makes a lot more sense just because at this point he was a much more iconic character for the series. Meta Knight had only ever been in like 3 games, whereas DDD had been in almost all the Kirby games released up till that point. It just made a lot more sense as a pick. Plus, you know, it fills in the quota for Hammer characters because this roster doesn't have any Ice Climbers on it, because I decided that I didn't really want to move towards retro characters. And finally, for our last newcomers, we have Charizard and Mewtwo. I'm just going to explain how I did Pokemon for this roster. A lot of people, when they make these, are in the mindset of just adding one Pokemon newcomer per generation, which I definitely think is a very smart, legitimate way to do these things. I opted to not do it like that. I just added what I thought were the most important Pokemon to add at that point, which Pikachu obviously is the mascot, the fan favorite essentially, and after that you just add whatever is the most popular at that point, which seemingly the most popular Pokemon at that point were Charizard and Mewtwo. You know, Charizard, he was, even though Gen 2 was not was the most relevant at that point in Gen 1, kind of lost its moment in the sun at that point. Charizard was still one of the most popular Pokemon. Just like the intro to Gold and Silver, how he's just there for basically no reason. It's sort of a testament to that. So Charizard I added really just because of that, the starter at that point. The same thing with Mewtwo. He's pretty much the legendary at this point in time. And I feel like those three together really represent at least the first gen. Maybe adding a Gen 2 Pokemon instead of Charizard or Mewtwo would have fit in better as a whole with the series, but I like the way I did it here. And finally, we'll go into the most controversial thing I did here, which is adding in Captain Falcon in for Melee as opposed to having him starting in Smash 64. The reason I did this was because, well, a lot of people are probably going to end up getting mad about this just because of, Captain Falcon's the icon of Smash Brothers. How could you not have him in a Smash Bros. Game? Which, yeah, obviously that's the way you think about it, considering that's the way it actually is in real life, but think about it from the perspective of someone working on Smash 64. Like, who's a more iconic Nintendo character at that point in Smash 64's development period? Captain Falcon or, like, Ness? Or, not Ness, like, Little Mac or Marth? Obviously, the characters that are, like, actually up and doing stuff while they're in the spotlight are more iconic than the guy who drives a car that you never see. I mean, sure, you could make the argument that, Ness was in one fairly unpopular game that was only one game at that point in time, which I guess, but at the same time, he's up in the front line of the game. You see him throughout the majority of the game. You see exactly what he's capable of the whole time, whereas Captain Falcon, he just drives a car the whole time. And, same argument could be made for Fox, but Fox is talking throughout a lot of the game. He has a distinct personality. This is a character as opposed to Captain Falcon where you don't really get that. With that said, I do think that it made sense to put him in Melee because there is F-Zero X came out after that, and there was not a lot, but still some more character added to him there. Honestly, as far as like character goes, I don't really think that Captain Falcon needs to be in Smash Bros. Until Brawl, with GX having came out, and he had a lot more personality in there, but I think adding him in Melee would have made sense because, F-Zero X was new and there was something more there. And let me just say with this, I only actually added a new character to each series that actually got a new game in between Melee and 64. Those being Mario, Donkey Kong, Zelda, Kirby, and Pokemon, and I guess F-Zero. Another reason that I just added Captain Falcon in the way I did was because without him, there was no new series rep in this. This is it. So I feel like it makes sense to add him in here just because I don't know, it just makes sense to me in my brain overall. So I guess moving on to Brawl, this is actually, quite a lot of time has passed at this point. So I added 18 characters, quite a large amount of new characters. The characters I did add are Bowser Jr., King K. Rool, Wario, Toon Link, Vaati, Ridley, Meta Knight, Sceptile, Lucario, Crystal, Samurai Goro, Ike, Lucas, Olimar and Pikmin, Ray01, Isaac, Snake, and Sonic. Quite a large amount of new characters, but we'll get through it. Just to sort of take out these because it's a very simple concept here. I just decided to keep the third-party characters the same way they are in the actual games. They're very... There's a lot more going on there as far as legal reasons and such with the third-party characters than with, characters owned by Nintendo, so I decided to keep it the same just to keep everything, stable, I guess. So moving on to things that actually matter, or things that have actually been changed. I added Bowser Jr. really just because he'd become a very prominent Mario character at this point. Obviously he's more prominent now with the fact that he's pretty much the second in command as far as villains go. But at this point, he had been in Mario Sunshine and New Super Mario Bros. And pretty much all the spin-offs between those two, so I feel it's justifiable to have him in Brawl. I guess as far as moveset goes, he could have paintbrush moveset because the concopter thing hadn't really made a comeback yet, but, they could have come up with something for him. As far as Donkey Kong goes, I decided to give them King K. Rool because one of the few villains that hadn't been represented at that point. He's got a lot. He actually has had appearances between this and Melee. There were some spin-off games on the GBA and GameCube, and I guess the Wii that had him in it. It's justifiable. I added Wario because WarioWare had really taken off and become a major series. And also, he was continued to be in the Wario Land games. I think that it made sense to keep him around. I'm going to skip over Zelda characters for now because that requires a lot more explanation. I added Ridley because of Metroid really taking off in between Melee and Brawl. Metroid, the Prime Trilogy plus Fusion and Zero Mission. Ridley really should have been added in Brawl. There was no reason to not put him in at that point. Meta Knight, for pretty much the same reasons he was actually added. He had been in more games. There was Air Ride, there was Nightmare in Dreamland, Squeak Squad, Canvas Curse. I don't think he's actually in either of those games, but he'd had quite a few more appearances since then. Next with Pokemon, I added Sceptile and Lucario. Some other people I've seen said that Sceptile should have been added in Brawl without having Charizard. I think that having another starter there, and at that a much more popular starter before Sceptile being added, really is more justifiable with Sceptile being there, because, with just Sceptile there, it's like, oh, why didn't you go for Blaziken, or why didn't you go for Charizard, or whatever. I think that having both of them really sort of balances things out, and it's like, oh, we've got a Fire starter from Gen 1 and a Grass starter from Gen 3. That makes sense. I don't know. I just think it makes sense. Lucario was added as a 4th gen rep for the same reasons he was a 4th gen rep in Brawl. Just sort of made sense as a character pick. Crystal, just another sort of obvious pick. Star Fox had 3 games in between Melee and Brawl? I think that's enough to justify a new character, especially one that has a lot of moveset potential. I know the picture I have of her here has her with a gun, but that's really just because that's the only PNG file I could find of her. If I was to make a Crystal moveset, I would give her the staff from Adventures. So just think about it like that instead. There's a lot of moveset potential there, so I just added Crystal because of that. F-Zero got a few new games between Melee and Brawl, so I gave it Samurai Goro. Just another major character that should be represented. Obviously, the cutscenes and storyline in GX really sort of more justifies an F-Zero character being added, so Samurai Goro is the most logical pick there, because it's not like now where we've also got Black Shadow, where we'd sort of need to have someone replace the Ganondorf moveset. But, in this situation, there is no problem with the Ganondorf moveset, so Samurai Goro, with his, I guess, uniqueness, just sort of fits better. Fire Emblem got a couple more games, most notably Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. It's really debatable if Radiant Dawn actually had an effect on Brawl, but I'm sure Sakurai acknowledged its existence while making Brawl, even though it was Path of Radiance Ike that was in Brawl. But with that said, Path of Radiance at least was a big enough game to get a character in, so I agree with Sakurai on the inclusion of Ike. Finally, Mother got Mother 3, and the main character of that, Lucas. And Lucas ended up being a semi-clone of Ness in the final version of Brawl. I feel like the two of them have enough differing moves to really justify the two of them not having the same moveset, so I added Lucas in here just because of that. And finally, before I go to the Zelda characters, Some miscellaneous franchises, Custom Robo, Golden Sun, and Pikmin all got all got at least 2 new games released internationally. So I agree with Sakurai on Olimar and disagree with him on having Ray01 and Isaac as assist trophies, and I think they should have been added as assist trophies. Finally, going into the Zelda characters, I have Toon Link and Vaati. Toon Link is probably the most controversial thing I've done in all of these rosters, but hear me out. Between Melee and Brawl, there were, I think, 6 Zelda games. 5 of those were Toon games, where you're playing as a Toon Link. The only one that wasn't was Twilight Princess, which was heavily represented in Brawl. But Toon Link in Brawl was a clone. I feel like the two of them have enough differing moveset potential to justify Toon Link not necessarily being a clone of regular Link. Like, Toon Link's got the Deku Leaf, which he could use as a recovery move, and he's got the Iron Boots that he could use as a down special, and, just a bunch of stuff like that that really could justify Toon Link not necessarily being a clone of Link the way he was. So I mainly put him in just so I could balance out and justify the inclusion of Vaati. Vaati is an interesting character, one of the best choices for a new Zelda rep in even real life. The problem is he's not relevant anymore. The last game he was in came out before Brawl, so there was no reason to have him in the new one. So it would have been best if they just added him in Melee, or Brawl. So I added him here. There's a bunch of moveset potential. I would have found it weird had they had a Toon villain, but no actual Toon hero character. And I think that the numbers of games that they had for each style of the Zelda series sort of fits together with the way that I represented the Zelda characters in this roster. So, moving on to Smash 4, this is actually pretty similar to what we ended up getting with Smash 4, or are going to be getting, depending on when I upload this, I guess. The newcomers I added here are Rosalina and Luma, Dixie Kong, Impa, Zero Suit Samus, Robin, Greninja, Bandana D, Palutena, Shulk, Mega Man, Pac-Man, the Villager, Issa, and the Mii Fighters. And the only cut I made was Snake. As I said already, I decided to keep the third-party characters the same because of, the way legal things work out. So, as you can see, quite a few of the newcomers from Smash 4 are here. Whether they'd already been in the roster beforehand, like Little Mac or Bowser Jr., or were added in here, like Rosalina and Luma or Shulk. Overall, I agree with a lot of the picks made by Sakurai in the end, and even with ones that I never really would have agreed that much with, like Villager and Wii Fit Trainer, at least before their announcement. I do think they make sense as choices in the end, so, I don't necessarily feel the need to talk about those ones. So I guess that leaves me with Dixie Kong, Impa, who else? I guess Bandana D and Zero Suit, I guess. With Dixie Kong, there's Tropical Freeze. Dixie Kong had been around for quite a while. The Donkey Kong series had a huge revival since Brawl. I think that it's justifiable to have Dixie Kong in there. And also with Impa, there is... Impa is the most important Zelda character that had not been represented at this point with the roster from Brawl that I made. So with the major appearance she got in Skyward Sword, and the fact that Skyward Sword wasn't really all that represented when it came to characters, she could nicely balance things out. So that's why I added her. Without the necessity of putting in a replacement for Sheik, I still think that Impa fills in the role of like a ninja-like character pretty well in this regard. Zero Suit I added because of the huge amount of Zero Suit in other M, and also, this is an alternate version of the same character, which I don't have any others on here. I think it's at least an interesting concept, considering how confined a Metroid is to just Samus and the villains occasionally. I think it makes sense to have another version of Samus in there. I don't know, it just makes sense in my mind. Bandana D I added mainly just for consistency's sake. I had added a Kirby newcomer for every Smash game in my roster at this point, so I wanted to keep that consistent. Not necessarily important, but, just a little thing. And overall, I think Bandana D would have been the best choice for that. And finally, we have the last newcomer, which is Issa. For those who don't know, Issa is from Sin Punishment's Star Successor. When I was making this, I was sort of flipping back and forth between adding either Issa or Marshall from Rhythm Heaven. Eventually, I decided to go with Issa because I feel like he's got more moveset potential. His moveset's pretty much all there. You got your melees, you got your projectiles, you got your recovery, dodges and crap. I think that it just makes a lot of sense to the character. Saki was an assist trophy in Brawl, so I don't know, I feel like it makes sense to add him in here. So I guess that's it. I guess I'll go over the numbers. My Smash 64 roster had 12 characters, my Melee roster had 22, my Brawl roster had 40, and this roster has 54 characters. It's a pretty big roster, but I feel like the way everything worked out, like having a Fire, Water, and Grass starter with Pokemon, and having all the characters we ended up with for Mario here, I don't want to necessarily say that I think my rosters are better than what we got with Sakurai, but I think that these are at least very solid rosters that I made. There are some things like people will argue against Bandana D or maybe having Toon Link, but I feel like overall these are good rosters. So yeah, it's gonna be Legendary Sponge signing out. Cannot believe this video is 27 minutes long. Anyone who's able to sit through this, I'll give you a lot of credit. But anyway, Legendary Sponge signing out.